As a fan of Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, I have this question for you, Professor Kant, to set off this reenactment of your lecture. If we really want to understand what humanity is at its core, not what it pretends to be, not what moralists wish it were, but what it actually is by nature, shouldn't we start not with its rational or spiritual pretensions, but by placing it squarely within the animal kingdom and asking what kind of beast it fundamentally is?
First of all, the human being has to be characterized as an animal. Linnaeus says that, after all his reflection, he finds nothing that sets the human being apart as an animal in any special way, so he has to put him in the same class as the ape. If you tried to draw the human character from that classification, the picture would be pretty grim, because apes are deeply malevolent and deceitful animals. What we are doing here, though, is comparing the human being to all animals in general. So the first question we need to ask is this: if the human being were in a fully savage state, with no use of his intellect whatsoever, what kind of animal would he actually be? Would he be a beautiful or an ugly animal? A capable one or a clumsy one?
And before you answer, let's be honest about what is really at stake in this question. We are not asking about some theoretical abstraction. We are asking, what is the human being when you strip away all his comfortable self-flattery, all his moral posturing, all his civilized pretensions? What is left when you take away the costume?
Precisely. And the answer is both humbling and, in its own way, impressive. He would not rank among the beautiful animals, but he would be an extremely capable one because he has very dexterous organs, and for that reason, he would not be a weak animal either. Real-world examples back this up. Human beings in that state, if they were physically tough enough, have even managed to overpower wolves, although nobody today would dare take on that kind of fight. So thanks to his dexterity and strength, he would actually be quite safe in the wild. But he would not be a beautiful animal. Picture what the human being in a savage state would actually look like: naked, with a full beard, though even the beard might disappear in a fully naked state, since the fluids currently suppressed by clothing, which cause the beard to grow, might simply evaporate, and otherwise completely crude in every way. That would be quite an ugly animal. So there is still a lot to argue about when it comes to beauty. The English captain William D. Dampier, who published an account of his travels, also notes that savage women look very ugly since they let their long breasts hang or throw them over their shoulders. Today, the human being makes himself beautiful through the use of his intellect. The seat of beauty lies in the face, where the muscles come into play and expressions begin to work. But none of that would be present in a savage state. His dexterity, however, cannot be denied.
That is interesting. You say the human being makes himself beautiful through understanding. But is this not itself a kind of will asserting itself, an animal drive to attract, to dominate, to impose a pleasing form on raw matter? Is the cultured face really so different from the peacock's tail?
The drive behind it may well be the same, but the mechanism is quite different, and that difference matters enormously for understanding what the human being actually is. Which brings us to the next question: what would his physical form actually look like? Would he walk on 2 feet or 4? This is actually a pretty important question once you raise it. It has not really been investigated properly yet, so it needs to be worked out a bit. Because the human being was destined to have intellect, he was therefore destined to walk on 2 feet. since intellect is best developed in that posture, and since speech is cultivated by intellect, the human being must therefore be physically built in a way that makes it possible to produce speech. And even if the first language had been directly revealed to him, the human being could still end up in circumstances where he would forget it entirely. But if we strip away intellect and speech, what would actually be the best way for the human being to live? Would it be better for him to walk on 2 feet or 4? For that question, you need to look up the theory by the anatomist from Pavia, Peter Mascati. It is the best and most elegant treatment of this kind, written with impressive anatomical skill.
But this raises a deeper question about nature's intentions, or rather, about whether nature has intentions at all. Is the human being's intellect something nature specifically aimed at, or is it an accident that nature has merely permitted and not yet eliminated?
That question cuts right to the heart of the matter, and the answer is actually more subtle than either a simple yes or a simple no. Nature's purpose with the human being was to preserve the species. Therefore, nature has built him in such a way that he could survive in any circumstances. If he were built solely for civilized life, he would perish if he fell into savagery. If he were built only for savagery, he could never develop his intellect. In order to maintain himself as an animal, he therefore needed to be built in such a way that his characteristics and instincts would still serve him well, even if he happened to develop his intellect, which would always remain a contingent possibility. If he had intellect, he could then force himself to walk on 2 feet, since human intellect always promotes favorable conditions for itself. But nature also provided for him in such a way that he could exist even without intellect. Our physical build is in fact arranged for walking on 2 feet. Apes have a similar build and yet walk on 4 feet, although they can also walk on 2, but it is not essential for them. Our arms are too short relative to our legs, whereas apes have very long arms, so that they are almost upright even when walking on their front limbs. On the island of Madagascar, however, there are people who have very long arms and occasionally walk on 4 feet, and that kind of thing can change enormously over time and with prolonged use. So the original form of the human being cannot really be definitively determined.
So, even the human form is not fixed. It is plastic, malleable, subject to the pressures of circumstance. That much is consistent with what I would say. But tell me, what about his inner character, his drives, his relation to his own kind? Is he, at bottom, a social animal or an antagonistic one?
Antagonistic, without question, and more deeply so than most people are comfortable admitting. As an animal, the human being is an extremely combative one. In the wild, there is nothing he fears as much as another human being. That is why Robinson Crusoe on his island was so alarmed when he discovered human footprints. Think of what that moment really means. He had survived storms, predators, and complete isolation, and yet a single set of human footprints was enough to fill him with dread. A human being can learn to handle just about any wild animal once he knows its nature and how it behaves, but he cannot manage his own kind, because a fellow human being is a cunning creature whose traps he cannot detect. Another person can pretend to be friendly while acting with hostility, knows how to disguise himself and dissemble, and is always coming up with new ways to become dangerous. Anyone can feel this in themselves. If you had been alone on an island for a long time and thought yourself safe, you would be deeply frightened to suddenly discover another human being. because now you would no longer be safe. Now you would have an enemy far more dangerous than any wild animal, one who could set traps for you, watch your every move, and threaten you from every angle. Unless, that is, two people find each other when they have the same needs and are in the same predicament. Then they get to know each other and can live together sociably. But even then, neither can fully trust the other, because he never quite knows whether the other is plotting against him.
Yes, and notice what that tells us about the social instinct. It is not rooted in genuine love of one's neighbor. It is rooted in shared vulnerability and mutual need. People come together not because they want to, but because they must. Is that not the real foundation of every society, every state, every moral code? Not noble sentiment, but barely concealed mutual suspicion?
That is a sharp observation, and it connects directly to what we need to say next.